Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Cup Duet Reviews. I am your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and we are very excited to be talking about The Beatles' Get Back, which is the new three-part documentary that is currently streaming exclusively on Disney Plus. And I am joined here by a very special guest. Fans of the show might remember him from the two-part interview that we did with him a while back. He is a legendary composer and sound designer who's had a very robust career that you can hear all about in that interview. And we're excited to have him here today to talk all about the Beatles. Michael Roth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to try to be slightly less robust.
It's okay. No, we love your robustness. That's why we keep having you back. So I have to ask first and foremost, before we dive into this really exciting piece of film that we have had the good pleasure to watch, what is in your cup?
I have two cups, Ryan.
Okay, what's in them?
Okay, so first, as usual, this is like mango juice with like soda stream. So it's carbonated.
Very nice.
And my coffee is just plain old coffee in a mug. But the only thing I'll say about the mug, for what it's worth, here I'm going to hold it up to the camera, and you'll see it says Stalag Luft 3.
Okay.
Ex-prisoners of war. And why do I have that? Because, and this is a British thing too, there's a great movie of my childhood from 1964 called The Great Escape. And I became obsessed with that movie. And I've actually been to where it in fact happened, which was in Germany, now in Poland. And this is a cup that I bought from a museum in Zagen, Poland for Stalag Luft 3, which is the German prisoner of war camp where the Great Escape happened. So for the trivia buffs out there, eat it up.
All right, thanks for sharing that. And as for me, I am also drinking coffee, and I have it in our Cup of Hemlock cup.
Fantastic.
So, wonderful.
Yeah.
I also noticed something interesting in the background there. I see your little green apple. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. Well, I imagine you can still get these, but I got this about 10 years ago. This is called the Beatles USB. So if you hold it up, you can just see Beatles there, right? Yeah, it's kind of there, right? It's rather heavy, actually. Okay, it's a good paperweight kind of thing. But when you take this out, there is the Apple stem. And so when you put this into your computer,
like a little USB drive,
yeah, there it is everything the Beatles did.
Okay.
So every single, every LP, everything in really good recordings, not the remastered. They've gone through several remasterings in their history, but anyway, and I bought this because I was doing a gig with Michael McKean, who was in Spinal Tap and many other things, and we were talking about the Beatles so much that he said, well, you need to buy yourselves one of these, because he did. And I got it through Amazon. It was like $200. I haven't looked it up in a long time. It was never made in the States, and I imagine not in Canada. It was only made in the UK. But it holds a special place on my piano. It comes in a very nice box.
Great.
And it's pretty great. And that's why I don't have to buy any Beatles CDs anymore, because it's all really here, with little videos about them too.
Okay, nice. Well, yeah, it's amazing that they can get like hundreds and hundreds of songs on such a small device. Right? That's way the future. So I guess this is like a good transition into the kind of first question I wanted to ask before we ease into the documentary itself. But what is your personal history or relationship with the Beatles and their music?
Okay, well, I've never met a Beatle, which is a regret of mine. I don't imagine I'll ever meet Paul or Ringo. But I think what's important to say is that, so I am the exact right age to have lived with them while growing up. The Beatles were on Ed Sullivan in 1964. I was 10. And I very much remember it. I was not a musical prodigy. I was not a piano prodigy or anything like that. But within a year of hearing them and being drawn to whatever they were doing, rock and roll and all that stuff, and being of the right age to start saying what is rock and roll and all that, I started playing the piano along with the radio. You know, I piano lessons were not forced on me, and but when my parents saw that I was playing with the radio all the time, they said, "Well, maybe you should have lessons," and I did, and that led to forming a band in 6th grade and 7th grade and all that. So are the Beatles responsible for that? Well, to some extent, they are. You know,
Right.
I didn't know what anything was, and I was not into classical music at that time at all. Then, and I believe I said something like this in the other interview. Um, the other really powerful memory for me is, so I did buy all their albums and things like that, and I was now, then when I was 13, bar mitzvah age, the Sergeant Pepper came out. And what I literally remember doing, I had listened to Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, and I thought, well, this is interesting. But listening to the LP, which is not a phenomenon we have anymore, you go turning this up a disc over, all that kind. There is a logic to side one and side two that you don't really have now.
Certainly not on your little USB.
Yeah, and even on a CD, it's kind of one thing. But I remember sitting in my living room at my parents' house, so it's Long Island, New York, and I listened to Sergeant Pepper. I'm going to say at least 4 or 5 times or 6 times. I don't know. I just remember listening to it over and over again, and I didn't have this thought then. This is only a thought you can have in retrospect, but I realized that what was going on was beyond me, that it was reaching places that I didn't know you could reach. I didn't have a context for it other than this is still really good and it's still the same guy, so what are they doing? Right? And then so I can only say that I've not recovered from that. My curiosity as a composer, I'd like to think my open-mindedness as a listener to anything comes from there's stuff going on in music that you don't know, and you should reach and appreciate that, because that's what I did. I mean, hearing, and even the soundscape of it, they're not the Beatles, they're Sergeant Pepper. What's that about? Hearing concert sounds, hearing, for the benefit of Mr. Kite with all these weird things, Loosing the Sky with Diamonds, what a strange set of lyrics. As I say, my appreciation for Strawberry Fields sort of is a little retrospect to that, but it's even more profound. And they're still really good songs. They're good. They're good. They're not just weird. They're actually really cool. And they rock, right? So then, I mean, I certainly got everything when it came out. A Magical Mystery Tour and the White Album. And then when I was, I guess, 16 or 17, I guess, I was the editor of my high school newspaper. There you go. And I've not lived that credit now. And I was invited to a screening of Let It Be in Manhattan, because the way we watch stuff now, it wasn't there. And I remember taking the train into the city and seeing it there. By that time they had broken up, but that I can only say that is the most profound listening experience at that precise time. So we're basically saying between the ages of 10 and 17, when you are most open to anything. So my appreciation for their breadth and their constant exploration, forwards and backwards, going, which is what Get Back is pretty profound, and I've not let go of it. So
okay, you have not let it be.
I've not let it be.
No. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing all of that personal history. It really, I think, does inform where you're coming from in your relationship to, the music catalog in general, and specifically this piece that we just watched. yeah, for me, it's obviously well, a very different experience because I, by the time I came around in the 90s, all of this had long, come and passed. But
Although again, it's just so interesting, in the big question of what's the big deal.
mhm,
That it's not like they made it a big deal. The fact is, none of us have let go of it.
no,
And they are now academically quantified in a way that, I mean, I don't been in college in an awfully long time, but I know there are courses in
oh,
what they did, and my appreciation now, technically, of how they made the edit in Strawberry Fields, the layering of the pianos in Penny Lane, just what, or the orchestra in Day in the Life, all that sort of stuff is, that's what people study. That what they did with that we would take for granted now with something like Pro Tools, what they did with 8 tracks and the 8-track and Get Back, right? It's it's studied, and I know when McCartney's in concert, there are people his age, and he's going to be 80. And then there are, children and grandchildren, and I imagine even great grandchildren, all of whom know every song. And so what is that? That's very powerful and undeniable,
it's the very definition of culture. It's something that just kind of infuses itself into just the spirit of like the world. And
I mean, I know we'll be talking about this later, but I wonder if there's anything, because you are, yes, younger than me, if I were to mention, any other bands from the 60s or musicals from the early 60s or anything, how many of them would really mean something to you, and probably your parents played it first or something like that. It's generationally handed down in a way that nothing else is. So they are the one of the most important musical things of the 20th century. They are right up there with The Rite of Spring or whatever in terms of just their cultural impact that all of us deal with. And I say that as a composer, I can't. It's inescapable, and I say I'm the right age that it actually hit me at the
yeah,
right.
like I think this generational sort of transference is a good way of looking at it because I remember like I attribute so much of my own being a fan of the Beatles to my parents because there was the music like they're just like a little younger than you are, so they also grew up with it like in their kind of childhood and like adolescence as this like touchstone for their like engagement with music and pop culture, and they passed that along to me that when I was growing up it was a very frequent presence in my listening.
And it's good, and
it's great.
It's good. It's not like, oh, that's pretty good, what else do you have? It's actually good.
Like it's one of the, I think, well, there's probably a lot of things that fit this category, but it's one of the few kind of indisputable things that like boomers and their children and even like the subsequent generations all agree is good. Like there's no kind of dispute about so
and also since you're wearing a Hard Day's Night
for those listening in the podcast feed, you can't see it.
They also were really funny.
Oh, agreed.
They took what they were doing seriously, but they're 4 funny guys. They and A Hard Day's Night is really funny.
It's basically like a Three Stooges movie starring the Beatles.
And or even things like in Hard Day's Night, I mean, I've seen it a lot, but when they're in the train and you see John pick up a bottle of Coke and start sniffing it, and it got by them, and then just things like when there's an old worker, a middle class worker sitting in the compartment, and he's annoyed that they're playing the music loud and all that stuff, and he says, "I fought the war for you," and John says, "Oh, I bet you're sorry you won." But so
Yeah, no,
I
it's
mean, it's pretty great.
Mhm. So you kind of already started touching on this, but I think we can kind of maybe dig a little deeper into it because it's something that over this past week or so, you and I have talked a lot about, and I think it
Yeah.
does heavily contextualize what we saw in this documentary before we delve further into what was actually on screen there. But this artifact that we have, all of this footage of them recording the album Let It Be In, culminating in that rooftop concert, it's a very monumental shift in the history of music and culture in general. And there's actually like a specific interesting connection possibly to musical theater that you and I have talked about, and I think is worth sharing for all of our listeners who want to hear your insights on this. If you'd like to get into it.
All four of them, I'll have to call. Well, the historical context. I think what the thing I first want to say, I guess, is, and I remember when I talked to you and Mac about this, they met when John was 16 or 17, Paul was 15, and George was 14. They were from a city in northwest England that was not a musical center of the universe per se, and nothing like that is ever going to happen again, or certainly had happened, I should say. But they were kids, and in fact, John and Paul had both lost their parents in and around, or their mothers in and around there, and then this trajectory from them as teenagers to basically that's 1957 when they met. This is taking place 12 years later, right? They were touring Hamburg, which they refer to when Billy Preston shows up, in like 1960, 61. That's 7-8 years ago. They were on Sullivan in 64. That's 5 years before Get Back. So, and one thing, I think I even said this to you, that, in the time of the pandemic, that's as long as we've known each other, they basically did Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. Not bad. That's a good day's work.
That's as good as it gets.
It's pretty impressive. So their trajectory, and, by the time you're watching Get Back, it's like, if you're in a varsity basketball team in high school or junior high, and you're just great, you can't be in that same team when you're about to turn 30. It just life is not like that. And so the historical context of it is they've been to the mountaintop. They've had stuff happen to them that nobody's ever experienced. They're as a cultural influence. Our hair is the way it is because of them, right? Or if you wear wire rimmed glasses, that's a lot of John. Let alone all the musical things. But by the time they're there in the studio, and they've done various projects that have led them to even more acclaim than they could have had, because they're no longer a touring band. They're no longer a band that gets together and plays together. They've all aged to the point where, how much do we have left to even say to each other? And how much is Paul talking to George still somebody talking to a little kid? And that's what you're sort of, and all of it is going to break any second. And it should, because that's the way life is. How many people are in marriages that they've met when they're 13 and 14 and are, doing great when they're 30, other than some arranged marriages. very few. It's tricky. So anyway, that's I think the thing about watching it now is you're watching adults act like adults in a way that is maturing and painful and difficult, nonetheless really creative.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like, and I think obviously it's so important to like think about like I'm about the same age as them as they were when they like
Right.
were recording this album. Like now, so
Right.
for me to just think they've had their entire career as the Beatles already at this point, and
Yeah.
like I feel like, oh my god, what have I done like in my life?
Well,
But
well,
nobody,
exactly.
yeah, nobody can possibly like compare themselves to them
Yeah.
at that point, having so quickly and like so like yeah, in such a short period of time become the
Right.
biggest stars in the world,
Right.
and rightfully so.
Right. And 3 years before this, when they finished touring, and I know this, it's clear when you listen to the recordings of them in concert, in like their last concert in San Francisco, they couldn't even hear each other play. I mean, the fact is they're a really good band, but what's great about music and playing music with people is there's an unconscious communication between you with the other people you're playing with. It's a really interesting form of communication. It's very intimate. And they got really good at it in Hamburg and Liverpool. They were a really good, tight band. And you can still see that here. But if they get to the point where, yes, they certainly wanted to be successful and popular, but then they were so successful that they played in stadiums that there were no sound systems to accommodate that, and they couldn't even hear each other because of all the screaming. Yeah, it was time to stop, which led to, now what do we do? How do we define ourselves now? And the way they did was, well, they really liked the recording studio as an instrument. In other words, even on their first album, there are vocals that are double tracked. You don't double track in concert, unless another person's singing with you. But John's voice is double tracked in a bunch of songs. So is Paul's, right? All that stuff. So they were intrigued by what recording meant, right? Not having had any access to any of it when they were younger, right? Certainly nothing that they owned.
Yeah, and these technologies were also so new in the 60s. Like,
Right,
yeah,
right.
10, 15, 20 years ago, they didn't have anything nearly as sophisticated as like what we see. Like, or
Right,
like
right.
in, yeah, and it's heavily featured in this documentary, this kind of almost fetishistic relationship to all of this technology and equipment.
Yeah, and they're not being digital yet. I mean,
No.
I can do what they did, sit in this instrument I'm talking into.
Mhm.
But anyway, so I think they saw that as a way to expand who they were, and also they were exploring other ideas in music. And so, the great coincidence, so to speak, is that of all the producers in the universe, they ended up with a fellow like George Martin, who was um, not only open-minded enough to see that there was something going on in these guys, but since none of them were real musicians, none of them could read or write it terribly well. George eventually learned, but none of the others. But as they started thinking about what instruments can do, bringing a string quartet into Yesterday, which they all were really nervous about, they had somebody who could do it for them in a tasteful way that led to everything they did in their sort of mature few albums, which is only the mature albums, which are only a year and a half away from their slightly less mature ones. So, and they were all just their inquisitiveness to that. And once they stopped touring and were just taking life in, they were active in the gallery scene and the new music scene. That McCartney went to Stockhausen concerts and things like that. So I think their own inquisitiveness about expanding what it was. There are a million examples in all their music. So it's,
And another
And
point.
I answered the question, I think.
Oh, yeah, well, you did. And another point about the context that, well, one, again, you and I have talked a lot about this in this past week, but it's interesting that this documentary being released right now kind of falls within an interesting moment in, well, is another kind of shift that's happened in music history, and that is sadly the passing of Stephen Sondheim, which, at time of recording was really just like, a couple days ago. And so we also kind of find ourselves with the new West Side Story movie coming out, like I think in about a week or from now at time of recording, or perhaps it's already out, even as some people have seen it.
And I did listen to all of it.
Okay,
online. So yeah.
So, and I know.
I mean, I this is the other thing that we talked about, and I think this is the big thing that makes this sort of 2-week period kind of interesting, and you can even make it more like 3.5 weeks and throw Tick Tick Boom in there. But so what West Side Story as an accomplishment from Bernstein's point of view is something that nobody, not even, God bless him, Sondheim, has equaled. And by that, what I mean is that as interesting as Sondheim is, he's never put a 12-tone road. He's never. That's the dance break from Cool. Like Be Natural, it doesn't play, so sorry. But anyway,
I recognize it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And for that matter, there's a kind of an interesting polyrhythm going in there. Nobody had done that in musical theater prior to Bernstein. And he was really pushing all these interesting 20th century compositional techniques into a musical theater universe. And somewhere there is a quote that I know I've read and I've heard him say that he was going right from that to the New York Philharmonic. So yes, he's an enormous polymath, anyway. But he felt that West Side Story was going to be, and open up the doors to serious composers to walk in, and serious songwriters, or whatever you want to say, and to walk into musical theater and say, yes, this is a vibrant form for us to explore our musical creativity. In any case, he felt like that's what he had done in West Side Story. But the fact is that he himself admitted he was wrong, because what happened, and this is sort of coincident with the rise of the Beatles and rock and roll and singer-songwriters, is that if you were a composer and you wanted to have your music done, you could do it yourself if you wanted to become a singer-songwriter. And because if the Beatles could do it, you could do it. And so you have all of the most vibrant music of the 60s, in fact, had nothing to do with musical theater. But it was not something that really didn't exist 20 years before. If you were a songwriter like Richard Rodgers, you weren't going to sit down and record a song and have it sell. You were going to put it in a show. If you're a composer in the 60s, for that entire decade into the 70s, you're going to maybe record some music and see if somebody will release it on an LP. Now it's even wider. So musical theater did not become the center of songwriting creativity the way Bernstein had imagined it might be. It wasn't a progressive place. And
specifically because of the Beatles and this kind of shift towards...
because there's this enormous alternative, which is, hey, let's do it ourselves.
Yeah.
And something like Tommy. It's an opera, and yes, I saw the Who do it, and that I work with Des McAnuff, and I didn't see it on Broadway, but I saw it in La Jolla, and I saw the theater version. and the theater version's fine, but yeah, the Who doing it was really cool.
It would be.
And dramaturgically, you didn't question any of it. You knew kind of what was going on, but it's you threw it out the window, right? And so that was what's their musical theater? Well, it's something like Tommy, et cetera, et cetera. So for about 10 years there, the movement of popular music to something that you plug in and listen to and put on a turntable and all that took over from musical theater being. And there you go. The interesting thing is then the Beatles break up in 70, and that's when Company showed up on Broadway, 1970. That precise connection I had really occurred to me until we were talking, that I said, well, it's just an interesting
bookend, West Side Story on one end, Company on the other, and all of the career of the Beatles in between.
Because you could argue now. I mean, Sondheim is obviously there's much to talk about with who he was and what he represented, but Company is a pop music based score kind of. There's a rock beat to Phone Rings Door. It's a pop beat. And in the meantime, Hair had been there in the late 60s and all that, which again, was it a traditional musical? What is, Hair is complicated.
And Bernstein did not care for it, if I recall correctly.
I think I've read that too, but he loved the Beatles and could talk about them at length. And he analyzes their music. So he knew what good rock and roll was. I would probably disagree about Hair, but that's okay. So the kind of mix of the two is still something we're going through. Hamilton, of course, is now, and Hamilton is 40 years on from that, or 50.
Well, it came out in 2016, I believe.
So it's almost 50 years from all that, give or take. And a lot of it has to do with how we can amplify things and sound design and all that groovy stuff. But how all those worlds intersect is really interesting. And when you say my personal history with any of it, I could only say I didn't grow up on musical theater, right? I grew up on the Beatles and everything else. If you were to put, the cast album, The Company, and the Beatles USB in front of me, and you said you have to pick one, I'd pick the Beatles USB. Why? Because that's more meaningful to me. And do I wish I could have written another 100 people? Well, sure. Do I wish I could have written Strawberry Fields? Oh my God.
Yes, they're not mutually exclusive. You can enjoy them both, but obviously,
but which am I personally just drawn to? And I think the other thing, and this gets even a little dramaturgical too, but there's a song like "Dig a Pony." I grabbed the words. You can penetrate any place you go. Yes, you can penetrate any place you go. I told you so. All I want is you. You can radiate everything you are. Yes, you can radiate everything you are. You can imitate everyone you know. Yes, you can imitate everyone you know. I told you so. All I want is you. What exactly does that mean?
Hard to say. But now seeing them in the documentary, kind of composing it in real time during this 2-week period,
right. And it's especially Lennon. But McCartney too. Jojo was a man who thought he was a loner, but it could last. Sweet Loretta Martin thought she was a woman, but she was another man. All the girls around her said she's got it coming, but she gets it while she can. What does that mean?
Yeah,
I have no idea. Is it related to with trans issues or something? That wasn't in the atmosphere in 1969. But the kind of wordplay and the kind of I don't know what it means, but it means something. So I'm going to relate to it unconsciously because it's such a well-written thing. That's more related to beat poetry than the strict dramaturgical life of musical theater, if you will, right? You know what I mean? And
yeah, and if we want to throw in something else that was kind of floating in the atmosphere at the time, it was beat poetry. It was
right,
Allen Ginsberg, like, was huge at
right,
the time, like, and yeah,
yeah,
I don't think we can divorce any of
right,
these things.
yeah, and or and it's interesting because, like, I've written an opera using cut-ups, William Burroughs style cut-ups, and David Bowie used cut-ups. A lot of people in pop music do that to expand their vocabulary. Is that part of the expansion in musical theater? Not so much. Now, why? Well, musical theater is a very commercial enterprise most of the time. It's very expensive, and it takes a lot of producing energy to get it together. So does pop music, but it's just a different way. So if you're an artist and you're drawn to the expression of outside poetry and expansive literary techniques, all due respect to Mr. Sondheim, who I think was certainly rather brilliant, that's not who he was. And I know that he and Randy Newman, the one time they met. So yes, and for the people who did, yes, I work with Randy. You know, not that Randy is a cut up beat poetry guy, but the kind of off rhymes that are in rock and roll, that's what he grew up on. So to be told they're not perfect rhymes and therefore they're takes all kinds to like all kinds of things. But pop music, and for that matter, the people who grew up on pop music and then went into serious composition and didn't go to musical theater, they liked being able to express themselves in a rock and roll band, and then they went from that to expressing themselves in chamber music in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the net is wide for where you might want to go with musical expression. And musical theater is an interesting alternative, but there are hierarchical and conservative impulses in it that make it complicated. Boy, that was a mouthful. I should shut up forever.
Oh, it's great. No, like I love all these threads you're pulling together, and I think it is part of the context, and it is so kind of worthwhile to engage with this as a jumping off point into this documentary. And just to kind of one last thing that you mentioned that I do kind of want to harp on a little longer is Tommy is this interesting example, and I think maybe a turning point in this kind of symbiotic relationship that emerged after the 60s between musical theater and pop music. And a lot of it I think does come down to what you were talking about, just the actual commercial logic of making musical theater, how it is expensive, and this turn towards popular music. Especially like you could say in the 80s under like Reagan and Thatcher, when you had to really kind of make your theater profitable because you weren't getting government funding for it. It does kind of, I think, this turn towards pop music, jukebox musicals, like this kind of relationship we have to the 60s we see, and the music of the 60s we see it in plays like Leader of the Pack and in Jersey Boys. I'll have to bring up Des again, but like and I think the Beatles, watching this documentary, kind of it really is this linchpin moment in everything that you brought up and what we're talking about. And you look at something like Hamilton now, and what's the most popular force in music right now? Well, it's hip hop. So of course we get a hip hop musical that redefines the culture. So
and it's particular, and this is within a Sondheim context too, I suppose. But the strongest element in Hamilton. I mean, I like the music. The music's fine. I get and I wish I'd written Not Thrown Away My Shot, but the lyrics are brilliant. So, in other words, if there's something that Lin-Manuel does as a generation beyond where Sondheim is, or several generations really, it's because of the liberation of hip hop lyric writing and the intensity of it, and the, he is given that to a story in a really great open-minded way, and has the chops to, I mean, how hard he worked it.
Yeah.
That he didn't do that in a day.
I've
And
read every single footnote in the libretto. I know.
yeah, I know. I mean, that's and it shows. It's brilliant. So anybody who's going to try to walk down that path, those are big shoes you're trying to fill there. I mean, I don't have those jobs, and I don't know many writers who do. And those who do, in fact, are doing hip hop. Right? I mean, do they want to write a musical about James Madison or something? Probably not. Or about anybody else, about Alexander Bell, or whatever. Not necessarily.
No,
because,
you just record an album, because then you can just do that and tour and make a lot of money.
Why not make an album and have it live on Spotify and everything else? And again, it's interesting.
Yeah, and like Lynn talks about, or you can kind of, if you know the history of how Hamilton came about, it was originally conceived as just a concept album about hip hop songs about Alexander Hamilton, and from his experience in the Heights, he turned it into a musical, and good choice on his part. But
and good for him. And there's a really interesting story to base it on there, and yeah, I mean, it's a real triumph of lyric writing, of an aesthetic that's kind of bringing itself to storytelling. It's the technical skill of it is really worth digging into and admiring. And anyway.
Okay, well, we've been talking for, I think, over a half an hour now, and we barely even scratched the surface of the doc. So maybe let's dive into that a little more.
Okay.
No, I love everything we've talked about, and this has been so delightful. But let's just.
I hope this gives a context.
Oh, it does. 100%.
Yeah.
So let's just kind of start. What were your general impressions of the documentary?
Well, as usual, I will embrace cognitive dissonance, and even musical dissonance, but cognitive dissonance certainly. Of course I loved it, but I was going to anyway. Of course I watched it all, but I was going to anyway, right? I mean, I'm not an objective observer. And I think, given what we said about where they were as people, it's interesting to watch these guys work together, and how hard they worked, at the same time that they would then take a break and just jam on a song and then not. So I think you find, that for some reason, they've decided this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a month and do this album, and maybe there'll be a concert at the end. We don't know what this is going to be, but it'll all be filmed. Which again is it's pretty crazy, because you can see they don't know what they're going to do, right? So I loved it on the one hand, just because I'm such a fan, and I think those guys are kind of amazing, and all that. That's thought A. Thought B, you are watching 4 guys drawing apart. And it's very emotional. There's this, I'm sure you know this, in episode, the second episode, once George has left the band, you're really aware that McCartney has been clinging onto this. This has been his job for 15 years, right? I mean, when he met John, this was where I'm going.
Yeah, they were kids, as you brought up earlier. This has been their whole adult life.
And we can't, it's like, if this stops, if this breaks, this is worse than breaking up a marriage or with a girlfriend. This has been his life. And he's learned so much and scaled so many interesting mountains. So the idea that John might go off and and George has already left and might not come back, and Ringo is going to do a movie, and they all have kids and stuff like that. George, I guess, did. I don't know if Ringo did, but you're just aware in the life journey of people that you're watching an interesting moment in these four guys' life, because clearly whatever this has been, it's going to stop soon. And that's not because somebody did something wrong. It's because that's the way life and relationships end.
All things must end, yeah.
Yeah, all things must pass, right? And so it's very moving to watch, does Paul treat George well?
Not always.
Not always,
Mm-hmm.
but because there are times, and again, we all know what this is. If you've been friends with somebody since you were 16 and he was 14 or whatever it is, he's the little kid, and he's always going to be on some level the little kid. And then he's not, but then he is, right? That's, and you don't know that you're doing that necessarily. And John was the leader of the Beatles, but he's met this interesting woman, Yoko, who's comes from New York, who's part of John Cage's world, who's part of this highly experimental musical world in New York, who opened a gallery exhibit at the Indica Gallery that was largely sponsored by McCartney. McCartney told Lennon, "You should go to this because I can't go there." And that's when he met Yoko, right? There's a psychodrama. So that's quite something. Can we cling on to this anymore, or are we just going to burst apart? And clearly, and that's just so the interpersonal relationship. And again, it's not because somebody broke up the Beatles, it's because life is going to do what it's going to do.
Yeah, you mentioned Yoko, and it was something I definitely wanted to touch on, because like her presence in this, I think, is very interesting. Like, because I don't know, history and pop culture, whatever you want to call it, has maybe unfairly mythologized her as this malevolent force that came in and ruined the Beatles for everyone. Like, and obviously that's like not the case. And I think
that's more about our, misogyny and even our racism.
Yes, of course. And but like seeing her in this, like, it's so interesting, because in the first episode, she, aside from singing a little bit on like one little jam session at the very end of episode 1, she says nothing in the whole first episode. She's just sitting there. She's like reading a newspaper. She's opening her mail. She's sewing. She wants to be as close to John as possible. So she's present for all of it because they're in love. And it's like this kind of beautiful thing that they have together. But like, I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. Like, not even just like historically with my own possible like preconceptions of what this figure means in this story, but also like in the grammar of cinema, I'm trying to like kind of figure out like what is Michael Lindsay Hogg, who, shot all this footage, trying to necessarily frame by having like her so, in my mind, it seemed almost ominous, like that she was hovering around so much. And because we kind of have these stories that have circulated while this was being recorded, and certainly in the aftermath of her involvement in the collapse of the Beatles, like, I was kind of waiting for a fight to break out and that she would be in the center of, and then it just never happens. She like
because in fact it didn't happen. And again, I think, and even McCartney says this now. Again, you live and learn. He has said in interviews since then a couple of things that are meaningful to me as somebody who, again, is so much older than they are in Get Back. I mean, I'm 40 years older than them. It's just terrifying. But and I was 17 when I watched it for the first time, right? The fact is, they'd been in constant recording session or concerts or whatever it is for a decade in one way or another. John, married his first wife because she was pregnant, blah, blah, blah. Every line you want to say about that, you can't, because John was certainly a complicated fellow. In Yoko, he obviously found a soulmate, and he did not want to let her go. And what's the big deal if she's just sitting there?
Yeah, there's none.
And and that can only be true if this is the band that I started, 10 years ago, and she's just going to be here with me because this is it. This is very powerful. And as Paul has said about it since then, he really loved her. I mean, it was obvious that that's what was going on, and he can appreciate that now in a way that he almost does then. I mean, there's no resentment of her. It's a little weird, but it doesn't stop them from working. It's so, I mean, and Linda is there too, and
she's left like hovery, but she is like very frequently a present. Maureen Starkey's there too. Like it's the spouses and partners are all invited to just be part of it. It's a big environment with a lot of people.
Yeah, and because that's what they are. I mean, the more interesting thing, sort of, is what actually did lead to the breakup of the Beatles was, you hear talk about Alan Klein, and you don't hear talk about Linda's father. God, I'm blanking on his name.
Mr. Eastman,
because they both were capable of taking over the Beatles' management. So the other thing that's again an interesting dynamic in all this is, so Brian Epstein dies.
Epstein, as they call him, so with such reverence.
They call him Mr. Epstein. And the fact is, again, he had led them to the top of a mountain, and then when they stopped touring, suddenly, so I can't book this tour for you and arrange for all the hotels in the United States. That's not what he could do anymore. One thing led to another, and he passed away at 32, which is young, but older than them. Right?
Yeah, but not by much, which is a kind of interesting little detail there.
So they are leaderless, and you hear John and Paul talk about who's the boss now. And again, you can't objectify 1969 without going back to 1967 and saying it hasn't been long. It's only been a couple of years that they've been.
We've been in this pandemic almost as long as that little period in their careers.
They're in a pandemic where everything's shaky because they don't have their boss. And in fact, one of the things that's kind of weird, there's a sequence where you see Dick James come in, right? Who's a music publisher, who deals with their music publishing rights. And although they knew something about it then, they all know a lot more about it now, and so do I. I mean, it's because McCartney's bought catalogs, and within a month or so of that meeting that you actually see and get back, Dick James has already sold much of their music, because I believe he has sold parts of Northern Songs or something. I don't have any notes in front of me, so I can't remember. But the Beatles as a business is a big deal. It's millions of dollars, and they don't own their own publishing outright. In other words, Epstein as a manager had not done that well with that. So is Alan Klein going to come in and do that better, or is Linda Eastman's dad going to do that better? And they can't agree on it. And
I kind of wished more of that story was present in the documentary. It's just like subject to what footage they had, and they kind of certainly kept cutting to Alan Klein, especially more so than Mr. Eastman. But I feel like there's this. Well, there's so many just different angles you can attack the story from, and that's just another one of them that kind of makes it in the margins. But we do see scenes of them looking through the catalog and the musical publishing, and it's there lurking in the background, and does kind of also provide its own wave of context for everything that's coming to a boil at the end of this recording and this album.
Yeah, and the cognitive dissonance part, I should just say, what I mean by that is, is Get Back too long? Sure, but what else is new? it's. I mean, yeah, it could have been. It's what, 8 hours plus or
about
something.
8 hours. It's about as long as the RSC Nicholas Nickleby is, which for fans of the show, Mac and I recently reviewed in nine episodes. You and I are going to do something about the same length in one episode. So here we go.
And Nicholas Nickleby is quite an episodic story. But yeah, I mean, sure, it could have been 6 hours. I don't need to, I had said this to you, and I'll say, now looking at it somewhat objectively, Let It Be as an album, the Get Back sessions, it's not the greatest set of songs that they ever did. I Got a Feeling is cool, but I don't need to hear it 30 times. It's cool to watch them putting it together. It's basically a 1-4-5 rock and roll thing with a kind of an interesting middle. So, and I don't really need to hear One After 909 or all the early stuff that much. It's cool, but I don't mind it. I can understand how other people might get kind of restless with just, can you get down to it already? But I think that if you just kind of switch your brain to, we're just playing flies on the wall here, you can just get into a different sort of Zen mode of watching it, which is not so, critical. Where's it going moment to moment? But just say, you're watching this moment in time, and it actually is covering a month. And you're watching real-time things. So,
yeah, like this question of, and I preempted you, this is something I wanted to talk about, but this, do you think it was too long question? Well, I think it's so fascinating to me because they had 57 hours of raw footage to go through. Like, the fact that they made it this short is already so impressive. Like, and it seems ironic because it's 8 hours long over 3 feature films, one of which is like almost 3 hours, like in this runtime. All of them are over 2 hours. But yeah, like and there were times when like it does feel like it's dragging a bit, especially I would say in episode 2 for the most part, because episode 1 I think really kind of like hooks us in, and this is what's happening, and it kind of has this big sort of dramatic climax with George leaving, and then episode 3 has the climax, the same climax that the 1970 documentary had of the rooftop concert, which they kind of basically designed to be the climax of the film that they were making.
As you probably know, even a few minutes before it began, nobody knew if it was really going to happen.
Well, if the roof could support the weight of all their equipment.
I wish there had been a 12th camera in the basement or wherever the poor guys were, where Lennon finally said, "Fuck it, let's just play."
Yeah, that's right there.
Because that's finally what did it. I mean, they all were going, I don't know, do we want to play? But yes, what is beautiful for me, again, about watching the rooftop concert, is at a certain point, this is the band that played in Hamburg. This is who they were 5-6 years ago. They're a really good rock and roll band, tight, and that's very, and they love it.
That's the kind of thread throughout this entire thing, that they're just having fun making music, which I think is like a thesis for all of this. Like,
right, and the concert on the rooftop, on some level, they must have known this is it. Mm-hmm. We're never going to do this again. We're never going to play a concert again. I mean, on some level, they must know this is a meaningful half hour where we're going to just play for whoever's listening. And they hadn't done that in 4 years.
And I feel like, to me, like, whether or not this is me projecting onto it, but I think I could see a moment while watching it where I feel like that clicked for them. And that was when they were in the middle of playing Get Back for the second or third time, just there on the roof. And the Bobbies were there on the roof trying to shut it down. And and John stops playing and George stops playing, and Paul kind of looks back and he keeps playing. And I think that is the moment where it clicks, and then the rest of them join in and get back into it, quite literally.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's yeah. So for me, it's very beautiful. Um, and yes, they had a few more months in them, to do Abbey Road and to go back to being a studio band and expand themselves as that. But that's the last time they ever played in anything looking like a concert, and they hadn't done that since 1966. So it's kind of a profound moment for these four young men, and that's what makes it an interesting movie. Is and and the iconic line, Lennon's last line, "I hope you pass the audition." You know that you just see they really were the Beatles, and they're really good at that. And Lennon's really good at like summing up the moment in this
with the just like fun and
way.
modesty that he has like to it. So like it's
Yeah,
they're the biggest stars in the world, but they don't. It doesn't get to their heads. Like it's they're just like still just jamming on the roof, like these four guys in high school.
And they're a good band that started in Liverpool. They're playing in the Cavern, and they were really good at that because they played together all the time. And yes, would I like to have seen them in Hamburg? Yeah. I mean,
if only a film crew was following them then. I could watch every sort of milestone in their history in a film like this. Like, just to kind of wrap up the point of like, is this too long? Because I think that is something that probably will be part of the discourse of this, and people will have conflicting opinions. Like, I recognize that it is quite long and there are parts that drag, but I would be hard pressed to think of what to cut. And that's, I think, where I'm coming from. And because they cut so much and we don't have access to everything they did cut to just make this, but we get to really spend every single day with them. I loved the framing device of the calendar that really kind of kept us on track and like showed that we were in there. And like, I don't think you could cut whole days from this. You couldn't, even if like nothing monumental happened. We need to kind of sit with them and experience this whole month-long process with them, see the dates shift, see that whole week they lost because George wasn't playing. Like,
yeah, to paraphrase Hamilton, you're seeing, you're in the room where it happens.
Yeah, we are, and that's
and
well said.
The fact is that watching anything happen in real time is slow.
It is, and the movie lets you feel that slowness, like it. And this is kind of something that, I want to, maybe this is another question that I wanted to like throw to you, especially now hearing that you like got to see this like screening, this original screening of the 1970 Let It Be documentary. So like, this is something I want to talk about because this 3-part documentary is very much in dialogue with that original piece. It's all of the footage that Michael Lindsay Hogg filmed to make that, which he cut down to an hour and a half to make just like a very clean, simple, here's them recording the songs and we'll culminate in the rooftop and that's it. Like, there is nothing else really happening. There's not really a story to that documentary. And that might be open to interpretation, but the thing that I think is interesting here is because when Get Back was first announced as something that was going to be coming up and released on Disney Plus, I read an article about it at the time and I will preface this, that this is before I had watched Let It Be, the documentary. I've obviously listened to the album many times, but it just gotten away from me. I'd never seen the documentary before. And the article I was reading, and I was trying to find it like earlier, like within the past couple days, but I can't find the same article I read. But it kind of misled me about what I was getting into, because the argument that the author of this article was making was that the documentary Let It Be has this like place, the story that it tells is about the end of the Beatles, and it implied that like that documentary is just them fighting, the band collapsing, and that's not what it is at all, which I learned now just rewatching it. It's really just like a clean and simple playing the songs. You don't see barely any dialogue, no fighting at all, and you would
you get a hint of it between George and Paul,
but barely. But it's like, if you like without any context, just watching that documentary, you would have no idea that they're going to break up by the end of the year. I kind of, and then what the argument that this author was making is that, so now what Peter Jackson has done by restoring all of this footage is showing that it wasn't all bad. He shows the good and the bad, and that there was, and certainly that is what Get Back does, but I don't feel like it's as in response to the 1970 documentary, like this author framed it, which, like, you know, and I couldn't find the article now, trying to look back to it. But
no, I mean, and I'm sure. Look, I mean, I'm obsessive enough to read a lot and watch a few other podcasts of people talking about the same thing we are. You know, so glad we're joining the club. But no, I think you know, Michael Lindsay Hogg had a job to do in 1970 when everything about the way we're watching this, what is Disney Plus, right? You know, isn't Disney enough? You need like a plus,
more,
and we're going to stream 3 episodes of it. What does that mean? So every context of how we watch it is not even imaginable. He
was making a film. A film is a film is a film.
Right. And you know, it can't be much more than an hour and a half, no matter what, because it's going to have a commercial release in theater. And by the time it was released, the Beatles had broken up and things like that. So it had the context of a certain amount of that. I think, you know, Peter Jackson, in one interview that I saw with him, said that in many ways Get Back is a documentary about the making of the Let It Be documentary, right?
100% more so than it is of making Let It Be the album, which it is as well. But
it's like you're looking at, you know, the original text of you know, a Shakespeare play, and you're seeing every thought that he had behind to be or not to be, you know. That's why I think my own feeling about watching it. Again, it depends on who you are, but it's why, you know, because I also know, like McCartney said, once they had broken up. So once their jobs are gone, right? This is their job to be the Beatles, which is really weird because it wasn't. When they were 16 or 17, was it a job yet? What does that mean? Again, that whole transition from 16 to 30.
I feel like it might have became a job in Hamburg. I don't think anything before that. It was just guys jamming and playing.
And then suddenly you say, oh, we're a band and we're kind of making a living. Oh my God, we're really making a living. Oh my God, girls are screaming, right? You know, that transition is wild, but it becomes the reality they know most. And then they're in the studio where they do things nobody's ever really done before, certainly not at a pop album. So then, once they had broken up, all of them dealt with withdrawal in strange ways. Harrison was ready for it and released All Things Must Pass, which is two LPs, and there's all this stuff on it. I mean, he'd been waiting to do this, so he's really ready. McCartney solo album is quite good, and it's only him, but it was clear he went through a real period of like, what do I do now, because I'm not playing with anybody and I want to play with some other musicians because it's such a great thing. John goes off and records his solo album that you know, other Beatles are on, certainly not Paul though, right? And it's a psychodrama solo album, right? That's still stunning in its own. I mean, you know, it's just called what is that album called?
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
His first solo album, because he and Yoko releases it. I think it's just called John Ono Lennon or something. But anyway, it's a psychodrama album about, you know, how does he deal with the breakup of what one of the most important things in his life is, by being brutal about it and honest about it in a psychologically revealing and astonishing way that's quite singularly interesting. But McCartney went into a real depression sitting up in Scotland wondering what he was going to do now, right? Because basically he's out of high school, you know, and for most people, getting out of high school means going to college, and then bit by bit things happen.
Past all of that, like there's no potential for that anymore.
Right.
That stage
For
is
them,
like
it
so.
was like you're in high school and boom.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's that's but I don't think any of us had many of those thoughts in 1970. Because there's no particular perspective on it. But what keeps drawing you back to it is the power of what they did in 5 or 6 years. Their evolution as artists is still what we deal with.
Yeah, I know there's so much to talk about with all of this, and it is really like amazing. Like, I kind of want to, is there, there's so much we can unpack, and maybe the next sort of thing to dive into is just specific scenes that jumped out at you. One, I'll start us off with this. We already talked about how there's just so much time of them jamming, and it's just they're having fun making music. It is their job, and they are very professional about it, most of the time. But but between recordings, they just play a Chuck Berry song or a Bob Dylan song. They just love living in the music. And the moment that kind of, I think, really just kind of blows everyone's mind probably when they watch this is Paul basically improving what eventually became Get Back. And do you want to talk about this scene?
Sure. No, it's interesting because usually when you see somebody creating in film or on theater, or when somebody tries to write what that is, in the worst versions of it, it's some romantic vision. It would be Paul saying, "I know."
You'll wake up at 3 a.m. and write something down,
and I go, this is great. And, that's not what it is. And he's just, and
Griffin,
and Ringo and George are just there, and it's
flopping their heads along,
and John's not there yet, and there's and then and he's kind of, there's some
mumbling.
words that are
there's barely even
floating out there, but they're not cognitive yet. And but it starts having its own kind of integrity. And the other thing is he remembers what he's doing. So good, and then finally, as because George says, yeah, it's pretty good, you can, and they kind of, and then you do hear him say, all the girls around us said you got it coming, but she gets it while she can.
And we're like, wait,
that just pops in, and you go, that's, and it's an absurd line that's totally makes no sense, but it makes perfect sense, right? And then out of nowhere comes Get Back, back to where you once belonged, right? And you go, and suddenly they have this gem of a song.
Yeah, at least the chorus, and then the rest comes later.
And now, what's interesting, of course, is where did the phrase "get back" from? I'm not going to say it came from this, but what I will say is within the conversation you and I are having, it's unconsciously there, right? In other words, can we get back to who we were, right?
Get back to who we were. Can we get back to performing live? Can we what is this album even going to be at this stage when we're so close to the end?
And again, while we're both saying that, it's almost, it's like you want to say, oh, shut up. It's, because it's too much to put that weight into it. But unconsciously that's there, which is why I think it has
we're
resonant.
We're approaching it with this kind of, clairvoyance of watching it so long after the fact, and we know what's coming, and maybe Paul does too, to a certain extent, not with the same degree of precision that we have, but
so I think that's that's what it's like to watch somebody actually create something. Now, it's slow, it's just I have this idea, and you can see, yeah. I mean, now Paul McCartney's Paul McCartney. He's damn good at it. And there's obviously a kind of a brilliance to the guy. It's why whenever I teach about music notation, and I say it's good to learn this stuff, and there are people who say, "Well, Paul McCartney can't read music," and I say, "Yeah, but you're probably not Paul McCartney.
You people are."
And few people are Paul McCartney and John Lennon. I mean, that's that combination.
Yeah.
How these two boys met and became what they became.
The perfect alchemy of their two minds working together.
Right. And we're able to, there's even the classic one, because, well, she was just 17.
Yeah.
17. Never been a beauty queen. And he knew that was a bad line. And then Lennon's replacing it with, "You know what I mean." Now, what's great about that? What do you learn if your partner says that line to you? Because "you know what I mean" doesn't mean anything.
No. But
right?
You fill in the gaps with knowing what you mean.
Right.
Yeah.
But and this is how pop music is so interesting. That if you say what "you know what I mean" means, that it automatically dampens it and it makes it worse. But "you know what I mean" means "you know what I mean," and it's great. It's a great lyric, that you just take it. Your brain goes wherever.
And maybe you don't know what he means, but you know what he means. Like,
right. Yeah. And that's Lennon's sort of, wordplay sense and linguistic sense. Because also at the time, Lennon was writing things like, do you know "In His Own Right"? Do you know those things at all?
Oh yeah, I love that, because I also I've recently actually read kind of deep dived into Adrienne Kennedy not too long ago, and she has her kind of whole saga where she adapted "In His Own Right," and then more recently in 2008 wrote the play about her experience, being cut out of the project. So
right.
I did read "In His Own Right," and what's it called? "Spaniard in the Works" is the second one.
Yeah, works. Yeah, I also Watershog make me a cup of cup of hot charcoal while I do naughty what, but no wordy good heralds. All this that is going, John, do mine eyes to sleep me. Am I not looking at my own singing? I memorized this because I actually played me in when I was in Michigan a million years ago. But so it's a lot of it stuck in my head, and I know that's had a profound influence on me as a writer trying to reach beyond the literal meaning of language.
Yeah.
So that's a long way of saying, so lines like "but she gets it while she can," what does it mean? It means whatever you want it to.
It's and what Adrienne Kennedy, she referred to them as John Lennon's nonsense books, and that's what they were. They were just fun little poems that she could read to her kids and have. And but also she had the kind of inspiration, this would go really well on the stage. Can I get in touch with the Beatles and try to make that happen?
Yeah.
And
I know, and it does. I mean, what's interesting, and this connects it to the Beats, to William Burroughs and cut-ups. It's what Burroughs says, and so there's this opera of mine, There Thought and Back Again, where the whole thing is cut-ups, and it's because you're getting. You and I are talking right now, and we're agreeing that the context of what we're saying to each other, we both understand. Unconsciously, we're doing that, and so you are diagramming my sentences as I'm saying them, and you're saying back stuff that I'm diagramming unconsciously too. But there's a meaning to the language past that, to each individual word. So it's not so much playing with words to take things apart, but to kind of see where is the meaning of it. And that's what the Beats were doing, and that's what Lennon was doing in his own really interesting way. So and my question, outside of people like Gertrude Stein, for example, in things like Mother of Us All and Four Saints and Three Acts, is
even James Joyce I think is the frame of reference that I come to when I read something like In His Own Right.
Right. Or and God Knows Beckett, right?
Yeah.
Because and even Shakespeare, right? Is where does that show up in musical theater dramaturgical thinking about how the songs need to make sense, right? In other words, and this is my dilemma that I will take to the grave, and and I'll have 6 friends, but it'll be okay because you'll be one of them. But what drew me to theater was Beckett. Was not when I could have seen the original production of Company, but it wasn't in my wheelhouse at all. I mean, I didn't go to that. I went to Broadway musicals with my parents sometimes, but I might have known Company existed, but it didn't register. I went to the Fillmore East all the time and heard Hendrix sing, Foxy Lady, and I heard Crosby, Stills and Nash, and that was, and their wordplay even sometimes is pretty crazy, right? So that as a serious examination of how language works is in Beckett and in Joyce in literature.
But yeah, and Beckett got that from Joyce, who was his mentor.
Right. Yeah. And Lucky's speech. I said this, to a bunch of Beckett scholars, but for me, the move from let me take you down because I'm going to strawberry fields. Nothing is real and nothing to get hung about. No one I think is in my tree. I mean, it must be high or low. That is, you can't, tune in, but it's all right. That is, I think it's not too bad. What does that mean? Don't tell me. Okay, but the move from that to mankind, in spite of the waste and pines, quack, 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 in Lucky's speech, I totally can make that jump, right? What's weird in musical theater sometimes is that the desire to be literal is an interesting, and again, I get it, and it works when it works, and it's fantastic when it works. But the fact is that the absurdity of how we communicate and what language means and what the beats we're getting at, and in fact what the Beatles were kind of getting at, it's just interesting to me how that works in naturalism, that we want to be natural and we want to, all behavior is motivational, all that stuff.
Well, yeah, and I think this is another important part of the context. We've already kind of talked about the musical context and the cultural context, but Beckett was writing at this time. Ionesco was writing at this time. We're just kind of past that first wave of modernist literature, like Stein, like Joyce, and this is kind of part of the, it is the culture that this music comes into and is responding to, and I don't know if we've necessarily gotten away from it or if it's just mutated in different ways, but it's all just boiling in this moment, and very post World War II. This kind of French existentialism was a huge, obviously, influence on Beckett.
And these boys were, their parents were very much connected to the war, and England in the war.
Yeah, well, yeah, the Blitz, everything.
I don't know the last time that German planes flew over Toronto and bombed near your house.
Doesn't happen often.
Yeah, and it hasn't happened in LA either, but it happened in London, just 2 hours away or whatever, right? And their parents were,
they were there. They were in the bunkers.
Of that generation. And London and the Blitz is a complicated thing, right? And that's where they were coming from. The other sociological thing to say as an American, so in November 1963, yes, I was alive. Kennedy was assassinated, and that was a psychological blow to the country, sociologically, right? Yeah. I mean, a young, vibrant leader gets killed
on television.
Well, I mean, although we didn't see the film for a while, but we certainly knew, we saw some pictures for a while. But in any case, this is clearly traumatic. Yeah. And then 5 or 6 months later, the Beatles show up on Sullivan, and it kind of took this pain and put it for us over here while we celebrated something else that clearly was going to transform us in its own way. I mean, there's the timing of that, to say too much about it is to say too much about it, but it's certainly there. And, wow, let's celebrate this interesting thing. And the other thing, of course, and this is what's in Get Back, is, most bands don't automatically harmonize quite as quickly as the Beatles did. The other amazing thing about the Beatles is those three voices blended like nobody's business. And when you hear "Don't Let Me Down," when you get this "Don't Let Me Down," now this is an extra. There it is. But when those three voices harmonize on "Don't Let Me Down," which you hadn't really heard them do yet, they've been trying to find a way. It's 3-part harmony on "Don't Let Me Down," and you go, wow, it's a timbre, and it's a magical combination of those three voices, and there they are. It's why a song like "Because" on the next album is so great. And very few rock and roll bands explored vocal harmony as much as they did right at that time. I mean, there are exceptions, but they're them recognizing there's something that happens when we sing together. That's in fact an old-fashioned thing, harmonizing. That's not really a rock and roll thing, but they do it. In their early songs too. That's another sort of magical thing. I digress as I.
No, it's okay. I think we should move on because we got on so many interesting directions. Yeah. Another kind of moment, or it's a series of moments in this that I do want to make sure we touch on more so than we already have a little bit, is the kind of narrative arc that comes about with George's departure and return. Sure. Because especially the end of Act 1 or Episode 1, moving into Episode 2, really seems to be structured around this. And definitely the fact that we have these act breaks, something that was kind of occurring to me while watching it. And this, I guess, goes back to the "is it too long" question. Just one last thought on that is, I feel like it did at times feel too long, but it wouldn't have maybe it wouldn't have if they had split it into more episodes. The fact that each one is just this big kind of juggernaut with a lot of downtime, that if they had split hour-long episodes and 8 of them, they could have. It's on streaming, it's on Disney Plus, they can do anything. Sky's the limit. But I feel like this 3-act structure, not just because, Peter Jackson loves trilogies, because that's sort of definitely
right.
But he takes, the Lord of the Rings is already a trilogy, but then turns The Hobbit, a book much smaller than any of the Lord of the Rings books, and turns that into a trilogy too.
Yeah, but that's gilding the lily, but I digress.
Yes, but I think this kind of trilogy structure that they took all this footage and boxed it into in a way really does use the drama of George's departure to propel a lot of the story that they found in this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about just this narrative arc or what it kind of means, and not necessarily.
It's I do. I mean, we've sort of addressed it a bit that clearly George is the younger brother who's learned a lot about songwriting from these guys, but has also explored his own consciousness in a way that they haven't. That's what meditation is about.
We see the Hare Krishna sitting there in the studio hall on the floor.
And clearly he's, spiritually a very interesting person who found his way into that world. So writing a song like "All Things Must Pass," that's who he is. So he's writing personal songs about. I mean, John Lennon could never write "My Sweet Lord." Oh my God, that would not happen, right? So I think, as far as the movie goes, you kind of wish that you could have seen what meeting at Ringo's house the next day didn't go well and what that means. But you don't, because all you have is what they have. But I think the way that Jackson handles it is about right. In other words, it's not like George stood up and stormed out. He said, "Well, I'm going to leave the band.
Fun, bye,
and see you around the clubs." And which, in its own way, as opposed to, you fucking asshole, stop bothering me.
That's what I think everyone was expecting it to build to, and then it doesn't.
It's not, and that's George. Who's again all of 26. I think, right? I don't think he's 27.
Yeah, no, I think 25 or 26.
Yeah. That's his spiritual maturity to say, I'm being pushed down, and I don't want this to happen anymore. So goodbye, boys. And you are condescending to me, but I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say, I think it's time for me to go. And they'd had moments like that, because Ringo had left the band too, because he was wondering what he was doing. That happened, I think, in the middle of the White Album. But clearly, it's a dilemma that I think plays out about right, because it kind of holds up the works until they can figure out and clear. And but on the other hand, yes, the dialogue between Paul and John that is illegal.
Yeah, that I wanted to touch on that too. The kind of ethical implications of recording them.
I mean, put it this way, McCartney could have objected to it being there because he didn't know it happened, but he didn't. So, but
he has producer credit on the documentary. He must have approved it being in the final cut of Get Back.
Totally. I mean, clearly McCartney didn't object to anything, including the moments where he doesn't look all that good.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to watch to hear what John and Paul have to say to each other, because you can see that John is. First of all, I don't know too much about the drug addiction then with him or anything like that. I think that's in there somewhere, but not in that moment. But clearly there's a part of John that's, saying, well, I'm not really the boss of it. And understanding what George is going through, understanding that this is their friend for when they were kids. And, and every so often, Paul's the person who keeps saying, well, now we got to do this because nobody else is saying, like, we got to do this. Right.
It's on the boss role, even if it was never assigned to him.
Right. And his ambivalence about it, at the same time that he's brilliant enough that his creativity gene is dominating him to the point of saying, no, do this, no, do this, no, do this. The interesting thing about that, this comes to composition too, is, of course, if you write things, I compose and everything's written out pretty much, right? Sometimes there's improvisation by some players, but I always have a lot of alternatives. It's a different universe for me. They don't write anything down other than lyrics. So what they do as players is what they do. And how do you tell somebody, no, don't do that, do this?
There's no instructions to follow.
One thing to do it when you're 15, when you're 25, 26, and you're already Beatle George. Yeah. So it's capturing, as I say, this meaningful time in their lives. So I think Peter Jackson handled the transition from episode 1 to 2 about right.
Agreed. And I think that was the moment to end Act 1 on this point of tension. Just from a pacing perspective, and this isn't Peter Jackson's fault, it's just the nature of, following the calendar, which I think is a good convention to do. But in my mind, while they do lose a whole week of work in the timing of the film, it kind of goes by too quickly. I think we resolve the tension of that and get straight back to work as soon as he's back. But
Yeah.
But
Well,
what can you do? It's
right,
archival footage. Yeah.
we don't have what they actually. We don't have Paul, and I'm going to make this up. Paul and John saying, "Okay, but we really need you."
Yeah, like it's not a biopic. It's not like, I don't know if you watch Bohemian Rhapsody, but it's not like Freddie apologizing to the rest of Queen saying, I can't do it on my own. Like,
yeah. And the fact is, I don't care who you are as a playwright. If you wrote that, it wouldn't be very good.
No, because in Bohemian Rhapsody, it kind of wasn't. Like, not to dig that too much.
I mean, God bless you if you're a screenwriter, but I wouldn't want to write that scene.
No.
I mean, the only way I'd want to write it is with absurdist lyrics, right?
Yeah.
And just push it up to there to, because they know each other too well
this is a high context relationship that they have with each other. They don't need to really have the words, like,
and so it's interesting.
Yeah.
But I suppose I wonder if we should chat about Billy Preston.
Oh, I would trust me. That's actually the next point on my list, because
I have the feeling it was.
Let's do it. Get into it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what I didn't know, is I had thought for some reason that George had called him or something.
Well, and the interesting thing, but I know where you're going with this, but the interesting thing is in episode 1, George talks about him long before he's even showed up on the scene. He talks about when they were in Hamburg, and he talks about seeing him and Ray Charles' band, just the virtuosity that he displays.
Right.
So, and like, because I, at this point, had recently watched the Let It Be documentary from 1970, I'm like, okay, this is interesting now, because I knew he's going to show up, even though in that documentary, there's no reference for why he's there. He's just suddenly playing with them, and it's cool. So it's that moment of George mentioning it all the way in episode 1. I'm like, okay, where's this going? How does he arrive on the scene?
Yeah, but it seems that, and I don't put it past Billy Preston.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, he's old friends with them. Yeah. He knew them when they were boys in Hamburg, and he was touring with Ray Charles, and he,
Little Richard, I think he was in Hamburg, and then again with Ray Charles later on.
Right, with Little Richard, you're right, and was in town doing a TV special with Lulu, which is pretty wild, and decided to pop by. Now, that's pretty cool. Or if George called him, or if they were in touch and he said, "Well, stop by just to say hi." I don't think that anybody said, "By the way, we really need you to play," until you see it in the moment. And that moment we see where John says, because they're reaching a point where, it's just the four of them. There's a keyboard missing.
Yeah.
And if they play keyboards,
guitar or bass missing. Yeah.
Yeah. And boy, does Billy Preston just like hit.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I mean, and he's loving.
Oh yeah, he's having a great time, and it's just so serendipitous that he's even there in the first place.
And and just the gospel licks that he's thrown in. None of the guitars can do that, but the keyboard can. And it's a Fender Rhodes, so it's an even kind of hipper sound of this thing. And it's just great, and he clearly kicks them up,
and also liberates the pudding on the album, like it's there.
And liberates them from having to carry that weight. So totally, because now there's another instrument there that really helps them, and plays the little, "Don't Let Me Down." All the little piano fills. None of them had been there for the first 5 hours of this thing, or the first 4 hours of this thing. You've been hearing "Don't Let Me Down," just guitar, but that little fill hasn't been there yet.
Yeah.
And he does it, so, and none of them probably would have done, I mean, McCartney could play piano pretty well, but he wasn't really a keyboard guy the way Billy Preston is.
Not a
And
virtuoso, sir.
yeah, he's not, and John's clearly not. So none of them would have done what he did. And yeah, he gives you a little bit of gospel soul, and man, it just takes off. I mean, it really is liberating, and you couldn't have written that moment to happen, but it sure does. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
And it kind of one thing that's sort of just nice about it is John has a line kind of later on I think it was either near the end of part 2 or beginning of part 3, where he's like, can we bring Billy on to just be part of the band? Can he be a fifth Beatle? And obviously that didn't happen, but because they were going to break up by the end of the year. But it is interesting just seeing how actively involved he was in playing on all the tracks, everything he's recording. It's there on the album, that the versions you were so familiar with from listening to over and over again are with his keyboard. He basically became a Beatle.
Yeah. No, I mean, because he's also playing on Let It Be. He's playing organ on that.
Yeah.
And now I'll tell you one criticism that I have, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
This is the one thing that bugged me, is after the Roof concert, which is great.
Yeah.
And then you see them go downstairs and listen to it, and you see them all go, job well done, because it sounds pretty good. And then we go into the end credits, and the only thing that really bugged me was, I don't think in all 6 hours or 8 hours or 20 hours, there's a complete take of Let It Be.
There is not. To my recollection, I don't believe there is.
And I felt like, if I could have called Pete and say, Pete, re-edit the end credits so that we watch a complete Let It Be.
And on the same subject, I know Let It Be, obviously, in particular, feels like the one that's so missing, but I don't think they play Across the Universe even once in the whole thing.
No, because that had already sort of been recorded, and it was about adding things to it. So the basic track of that was done.
But it was in the 1970 documentary. I don't. So they do have footage of them at least playing it once, even if it wasn't the final recording that makes it onto the album.
I'm pretty sure, because there are different takes of it. This is my Beatle.
Yeah, inside baseball. Yeah.
Right. Because I don't think in the Get Back sessions they actually did a complete take of Across the Universe because there are, even on the recording, there's other instruments in it and other voices in it. So I think they probably added stuff to it, because there are several recordings of it depending on where you want to go. But no, and then the other thing that just to say that Paul wasn't the only occasional bad guy, and even as I say that, I want to slap myself. But
human,
the other thing is,
not bad guys, just complex people.
The other moment that, and I don't remember if it's in Let It Be, but it's certainly here in this one. George comes in and he says, "Well, I wrote a song last night. Would you like to hear it?" And he starts playing "I Me Mine," and Paul's there, and it's a really beautiful little waltz song. It's clearly, again, what does that song mean psychologically? Everybody's me. Social media, everybody's narcissistic, right? So okay, and Paul is, kind of looking. They're kind of looking at the lyrics and having an active talk about it. John comes in, and I have to say, this is one of the snarkier moments. I kind of went, I would be really hurt, because he says basically, we're a rock and roll band,
but you're also so much more than that,
and he starts just mocking this little waltzy thing, and you go, first of all, you've written pretty little tunes too. So what are you talking about? I mean,
that's Julia, like a diverse catalog of music they've created. Why is this any different?
Yeah, I mean, it's and for that matter, there's a Harrison song, Long, Long, Long on the White Album. That's 3/4. There, and John's song, Julia, which is a spectacular song, is certainly not a rock and roll song,
Yesterday isn't a rock and roll song. Like
Yeah.
this isn't anything new. Like
so it's just weird and snarky and feels so strange. You know what I mean? It's like, have the drugs kicked in and made you just angry, or have the drugs not come in and you're now just feeling snarky about little brother George? Because that's actually that's the more painful one to me, because it's John, and George's relationship with John is like the big older brother when they meet, right? Because he's
the year or two older,
years older, right? I mean, he's like the senior in high school that you become friends with when you're, in 8th grade. I mean, that's a big leap. So he's really that. So for him to be that dismissive.
Yeah, and it's different from the times when Paul is a little on the harsher side, because those are always in the context of like, we got to get it done the way I want it. Like, it's still part of the work.
Yeah.
John coming in that moment is just like a personal gripe. It's not even like actually about what they're doing.
Weird and irrational, and also, I mean, it's a nice little song.
Yeah.
It's a modest little, pretty little George Harrison tune, and it's good, and it speaks to, as I said, it speaks to, this is somebody who sees this the first person identity in relationship to the rest of the world. He's exploring what that means in all of his songs, right? All of his most meaningful ones. So, isn't it a pity how we break each other's heart and cause each other's pain? That's the same guy.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I think we've gone on about this for quite a while. I don't know. Like, I don't know. I feel like we've touched on most of the points I've come in wanting to talk about. Maybe we can do a little concluding thoughts here before we wrap up. Is there anything else that you haven't addressed yet that you feel like is worth a merits discussion? Or just overall appraisals, if like you have any kind of last summation thoughts?
I put it this way. I'm glad that Get Back exists, and it will be around for people to watch for a long, long time. I imagine that there'll be a Blu-ray or DVD release that includes even more of it if you want to see it. I certainly, technically, knowing what he had to do to make it a cohesive, whatever it was, because there are clearly moments when there's audio and no video for what's actually there, and he has to fake the video, by like going to a long shot, that kind of thing. So I think Peter Jackson is to be commended for his patience of just putting all this together. He's clearly
4 years, I believe.
Yeah, he's clearly a fan. And I saw this little interview where he showed on an iPad. What they finally assembled was, here's the audio, here's the video, here are the blank spots with no video. They assembled all of it like that.
Big timeline,
yeah, big timeline, and he showed it on part of it on his iPad, where like the video dropped out, but the audio continued. And I've done things like that for 30 seconds. I've never done it for 56 hours. So he's to be commended for just putting this thing together. And I think the other thing is, these are the most influential rock and roll band in our history, and they, to quote musical theater, for one brief shining moment, there they were. Right? They were the center of the universe in an aesthetic way that we are still thinking about. And for me as a composer, to get a personal glimpse of what they all went through, and a combination of both their personal dilemmas and pain and whatever, and how that manifested itself, and at the same time having done things that were explorations of production. How do we turn the corner and find another thing to do? Well, let's get back to being a band. all those things are just really resonant and beautiful to experience, because all of us wonder about those things. If in theater you work really hard and you get to a point where you can overproduce a musical and it goes well, or it doesn't go well, or whatever, the next thing you should probably do is say, okay, we're going to light this thing with a flashlight, and there's going to be no microphones, right? Do you every so often have to strip everything away and get back to where you once belong? And that's, I think, a beautiful thing to experience here, of how they tried. And for about 45 minutes on the top of a building that's now an Abercrombie and Fitch in London, they succeeded. They became a really good band again, and
last time it's the big hurrah, like
and that's just very beautiful and meaningful. And I think generations will still constantly explore that. I the only thing I'd say is, don't look for who to blame, because that's finally looking at it, insisting that there's a negative. And it's really, to my mind, at a certain point, and I'm not yes, I'm an aging hippie, but I'm not Pollyannish about this thing. I think you have to look at the beauty of what their voices do when they combine, even live with no tricks, and say there's something to that is great. And boy, could those guys write songs. I mean, they really could. And and for me personally, and then I'll finish, they spoke to me in a way that nothing ever has since. I can admire all kinds of things, but living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. I think I know, I mean, I yes, but it's all wrong. That is, I think I disagree. That speaks to me in a way that nothing ever will, and always will be. And that's why I'm grateful.
Well said. Thank you, Michael. For my own part, I don't know how much there is to add. I guess because this is technically a review, although we have clearly gone in. If anyone's been watching this long and hasn't decided whether or not to watch the thing, I think, obviously we've spoiled a lot, but I don't think you even really can spoil this moment in history in 1969, because that's what it is. Like, when I keep coming back to this question of, is the thing too long? It's like, well, I don't even think we're supposed to experience this as I'm going to sit down and watch a movie or watch 3 movies, which is, I think this is just an archival document of the times, this moment in history, this moment in their careers, this moment in their lives. And I'm just so appreciative of Peter Jackson, of the Disney Corporation, of all the people in the credits who kind of made this possible, to just really get to spend this intimate time with them and see this whole thing. And the thing that, just to talk about the filmmaking a little bit also, I kind of just appreciated how unobtrusive the filmmaking is. Obviously, there's a lot of thought and mechanics that go into this editing, and it does tell a story. But there's no sit down testimonials with surviving people from the room. There's no narration. That we have the text on screen every so often, but not even that often. It really does. Obviously, the author's hand is still there, and because that author happens to be a very acclaimed Academy Award winning director, Peter Jackson, we maybe try to look to the authorship, but
you're absolutely right. Talking heads would have just killed this thing. And but as you say that, because I watched much of it again last night in preparation, because I'm that kind of guy.
Yeah,
Ryan.
you're a good student.
But I was thinking about the Bigger Than Jesus.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah,
and connecting it to just how ridiculous we Americans can be when we going to places, and I have no patience for it. What he was saying, of course, is, look, we're getting so popular. it's weird, man, because some people think we're more important than Jesus.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he was saying.
It was an indictment of the audience, of the prominence that they're giving these four plucky chaps from Liverpool. Like,
right.
Who are we to eclipse the literal Jesus Christ? Like,
right. Yeah. And then for people to completely mishear it, I mean, and of course they're going to quit touring after that nonsense, because who needs that? Right?
The drama, like you can just make experimental music on your own, go travel the world, go to India, do what you need to do. I
mean, who needs that nonsense? Nobody needs that, especially for really talented guys who formed a band in high school, right? You know, and are clearly exploratory artists who understand that people, that what he's addressing there, of course, is the absurdity of all of it. And he does go from that to writing, living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see, right? I mean, he does go from that to what does this experience that I've gone through mean? It's quite stunning. So watching that little summation of their careers, and it's all within like 5 years.
Oh, of course, yeah. And just the fact that they're able to reduce that to like this little 10-minute montage that prefaces the actual documentary proper of, okay, and now we're in the studio.
And now here we are. Right.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. I think it's great. I think if for those who are watching this and haven't watched it yet, you'll probably enjoy it. If you enjoyed us talking about it, you'll definitely enjoy the actual piece.
And in the end,
love you take.
Equal to the love you
make. Yeah.
There you go.
Well done. Michael, thank you so much for joining me. This has been an amazing discussion. Before we go, do you want to plug any, social media you want to plug? Do you want to plug future coming projects you have?
I better reform the Beatles.
Yes.
Well, the web opera,
of course,
continues to live, and people can watch it, and you can put the address here, thewebopera.com.
Yeah, it'll be in the description of this video and in the podcast.
Here, for what it's worth, the guy who helped me mix the sound for it said, boy, do you know what the Beatles were up to? Because literally you could not recreate what I did in the web opera alone.
No, you can't. It's not the point of what you've done there.
And the sound picture of it is, as a friend of mine said, is a couple of weeks after Abbey Road, and that's about right. That there's more stuff going on because of who I am, but the influence of them in terms of putting sound in and putting strange things in, that's still a part of me. So and I've composed episode 4, and I hope to film it in 2022, but the world is still on fire, as we know. And
looking forward to it when it does come out, because I've enjoyed the first 3.
But yes, because it directly addresses how we communicate, and I still feel like that is my point. And I will encourage anybody to watch it to please get to episode 3, because one friend of mine said he watched episode 1 and thought it was pretty cool, and then didn't watch it for the rest of the night. Then he was going to interview me, and he watched all 3, and he said, "Oh my God! By the time you get to 3, it's like this is terrifying." And I'm just going to it, so I will encourage anyone to watch it. Also, Playwrights Horizons in New York. In January, we'll be releasing a collaboration between me and a wonderful writer, Francis Yachukawig, who I mentioned in the other interview. It's a piece called The Last Words of Uncle Dirt. It was put together by me here in Santa Monica, Francis in Rhode Island, and an actor, Kokwa Lee, who lives in Amsterdam. And it's about a 500-year-old Chinese dirt god who is summing up his life before he gets pulverized into dead limestone, and including him getting eaten by a whale and witnessing a massacre in Oregon. And it's pretty wonderful. It's going to be part of the soundstage program at Playwrights Horizons that's in New York that's coming out. I believe we've it's been finished for a while, but I believe it will be released, and I believe we're going to do a music video too. So keep your eye open for that, because that's pretty cool. And then yes, there seems to be another project in the looming with a rather enormous star. We'll see if that works out, and if there's another person who, in addition to Tom Hanks and Chris Plummer, will sit in this chair with me and talk to me. But I'll let you know, because I actually will know about that in a day or two.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Ron.
Yeah, no, this has been truly a treat just to talk to you about this piece, about the Beatles, about this moment in history. Like, it has been an honor, and we hope to have you back on the show very soon.
Okay,
yeah, whenever you want.
Thanks,
for
man.
anyone want to follow Cup of Hemlock Theatre, we are at COH Theatre on all platforms. Like, share, subscribe this video if you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again real soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.